The night air over ancient Egypt was still warm, even long after the sun had disappeared beyond the western desert. Heat remained trapped inside the stone walls, inside the packed earth roads, and deep inside the mud brick homes that stood quietly beside the river. A slow wind moved across the land, carrying dust with it. Fine grains of sand drifted softly through narrow streets and settled into corners where shadows rested. The Nile moved calmly in the darkness nearby. Its black water reflected small pieces of moonlight between patches of reeds and quiet fishing boats tied along the banks. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. The sound faded into the heavy night. Most people were asleep now. Families rested close together on woven mats laid across flat rooftops where the air was cooler. Workers stretched tired legs after long days beneath the burning sun. Bakers slept near cooling ovens that still smelled faintly of grain and smoke. Children turned slowly in their sleep while distant temple fires flickered softly against the horizon. But even now, while much of the city rested, sand continued to move. It slipped over roads during the night in thin quiet waves. Wind pushed it slowly across open paths between homes and workshops. Tiny grains gathered around stones, around wooden cartwheels left beside walls, around market stalls covered with cloth for the night. By morning, many roads would already be half hidden again. And so, before the first pale light touched the eastern sky, another day of clearing the sand would begin. In ancient Egypt, roads did not remain clean for long. The land itself was always shifting. Beyond the green ribbon of the Nile Valley waited endless desert. Dry hills and open sands stretched outward beneath the stars. The wind carried pieces of that desert everywhere. Every morning, workers rose before dawn to push back the sand once more. The work was ordinary, quiet, endless. And yet the life of entire towns depended on it. Without clear roads, merchants could not move carts of grain through the streets. Donkeys carrying pottery from workshops would stumble through soft drifts. Sleds dragging stone blocks became slower and heavier. Temple deliveries arrived late. Fishermen bringing baskets from the river found narrow paths blocked again. So each day began with sweeping. The first workers often woke while the stars still hung overhead. They sat slowly upright from thin sleeping mats. Their joints ached from labor that never truly ended. Some rubbed tired eyes while others listened for the distant sounds of ovens being lit or roosters beginning to stir somewhere deeper inside the settlement. A few moments passed quietly before movement began. Sandals scraped gently against stone floors. Clay water jars were lifted carefully. A small piece of bread from the night before might be eaten in silence. Sometimes there were onions or dried fish left from yesterday's meal. Sometimes only bread. The air smelled faintly of dust and warm clay. Inside many homes, oil lamps burned with weak golden light. Shadows moved softly across walls blackened by years of smoke. Mothers adjusted sleeping children beneath thin linen coverings while fathers prepared for another long morning outdoors. Outside, the roads were nearly empty. The city still belonged to the night. Workers stepped carefully through dim streets carrying simple wooden tools. Some held long palm fiber brooms. Others carried wide wooden scrapers worn smooth by years of use. A few pushed rough baskets woven from reeds, ready to collect heavier piles of sand. The roads beneath their feet were uneven. Stone surfaces disappeared beneath layers of dust and drifting sand. In some places only narrow hard-packed tracks remained visible where feet and cartwheels had pressed the ground firm over many years. The workers knew these roads well. They had walked them every day since childhood. Near the river docks, the air felt cooler. Dampness rose gently from the Nile. Boats rocked slowly against wooden posts while fishermen slept nearby beneath folded nets. The scent of fish, wet reeds, and muddy riverbanks mixed together in the darkness. Already the first road workers had begun their labor there. Brooms brushed softly across the ground in slow repeating strokes. Shhhhhhh. The sound blended with the distant movement of water. They worked without hurry because hurry only made the heat harder later. The day would become heavy enough soon. There was no need to waste strength before sunrise. Small clouds of dust rose around their ankles. Sand gathered into low piles along the road edges. Sometimes workers paused to stretch sore backs before continuing again. Many had done this work for decades. Their shoulders were bent from carrying loads and sweeping beneath the desert sun year after year. Yet the roads always filled again. No matter how carefully they cleaned them. The wind never stopped for long. Farther inland, narrow streets twisted between rows of mud brick homes. These roads were even harder to keep clear because the walls trapped drifting sand. During the night, tiny dunes formed against doorways and corners. By morning, some entrances were nearly blocked. Women sometimes stepped outside at dawn holding small hand brooms made from reeds. Before preparing bread or grinding grain, they swept away the sand gathered outside their homes. Children still sleepy from the night helped carry small baskets of dust away from the entrances. The work became part of waking itself. Sweep the doorway. Clear the path. Shake dust from sandals. Begin the day. In wealthier districts near temples and government buildings, larger crews handled the roads. Officials wanted these areas to appear orderly when priests and scribes arrived after sunrise. Wide stone avenues leading toward temple gates were swept carefully each morning. The work there began even earlier. Under torchlight, laborers pushed sand away from carved stone surfaces. The glow of fire moved gently across statues and tall columns painted in fading colors. Workers spoke little. Most saved their energy for the long hours ahead. Nearby, temple servants carried water jars from wells while incense smoke drifted softly through open courtyards. Sacred birds stirred in shaded gardens. Somewhere inside the temple walls, a priest quietly recited morning prayers before the sun appeared. Outside, the sweeping continued. Always the sweeping. As dawn slowly approached, the eastern sky became pale gray. The stars faded one by one above the desert hills. Coolness lingered for only a short time more before the heat would rise again from the earth. More people entered the streets now. Bakers opened clay ovens and fed fires with dry reeds and wood scraps. The smell of warm bread slowly spread through nearby roads. Donkeys brayed impatiently while merchants loaded baskets onto their backs. Potters uncovered drying jars and bowls left outside during the night air. And everywhere beneath their feet, sand waited. The road workers moved steadily ahead of the growing crowds. Some used flat wooden boards to scrape packed sand from deeper wheel tracks. Others swept around market spaces where drifting dust gathered beneath stalls. At larger intersections, groups of men worked together pushing heavy piles aside before carts arrived. Their linen clothing quickly became coated in pale dust. Sweat appeared early upon their necks despite the cool morning air. Fine sand clung to their arms and faces until their skin seemed almost the same color as the roads themselves. Yet few people noticed them very much. The workers were simply part of the city. As ordinary as walls or wells. People walked past carrying baskets of figs, fish, onions, or grain. Scribes hurried toward offices with rolls of papyrus tucked beneath their arms. Farmers entered from nearby fields leading donkeys loaded with vegetables. Children ran through narrow streets chasing each other barefoot through the dust. Life moved around the workers constantly. Still they swept. Near the great storehouses, the roads required special attention. Heavy carts carrying grain sacks could easily become stuck in deeper sand. Teams of laborers therefore cleared these routes carefully every single morning. The grain itself mattered greatly. Bread fed the city. Without smooth roads, deliveries slowed. Bakers waited longer for flour. Workers became hungry. Markets emptied faster. So the men sweeping these roads often worked under watchful eyes. Overseers stood nearby beneath cloth head coverings, studying the progress carefully while holding long staffs polished smooth by age and use. But even the overseers understood something important. The desert could never truly be defeated. Only managed for a little while. By mid-morning, wind often returned again. It came softly at first. A warm moving breath crossing the valley from the west. Palm leaves rustled gently. Dust lifted from distant open ground. Small grains began sliding once more across the roads the workers had already cleaned. Sometimes laborers watched the sand returning behind them almost immediately. Still they continued. There was no anger in it anymore. Only routine. In the oldest neighborhoods, elderly workers sometimes taught younger boys how to read the wind itself. They pointed toward corners where sand gathered fastest. They showed how walls shaped drifting patterns through the streets. They knew which roads would remain clear longest and which would disappear again before noon. These lessons were quiet and practical. Like teaching someone how to carry water or mend a fishing net. Because road clearing was not temporary work in ancient Egypt. It was life. The younger boys often began helping around the age when they were strong enough to carry baskets without stumbling. At first they swept small paths near wells or homes. Later they joined larger crews working near markets or docks. Many never left the work. Their fathers had swept the same roads before them. And their fathers before that. Sometimes during the hottest part of the day, labor slowed. The sun climbed high above the valley until the entire city shimmered beneath white heat. Roads burned beneath bare feet. Stone walls radiated warmth long into the afternoon. Workers rested beneath strips of shade wherever they could find it. Some sat beside storage buildings eating bread dipped in oil. Others leaned silently against walls with closed eyes while warm wind moved dust around their ankles. Water jars passed slowly from hand to hand. The city itself seemed to breathe more slowly in those hours. Even animals became quiet. Donkeys lowered tired heads. Birds hid beneath shaded roof edges. Dogs stretched beneath carts where shadows offered relief from the heat. But the sand never rested. Tiny streams of it continued moving across the roads. Always shifting. Always returning. And so eventually the workers stood again. Backs aching. Hands rough with dust and wood splinters. They lifted brooms once more. In some places outside larger cities, roads crossing open desert needed even greater effort. Caravans carrying stone, copper, grain, or cloth depended upon these routes remaining visible. Workers stationed along these paths spent entire days clearing drifting sand away from markers and packed tracks. The desert there felt endless. Wind moved freely across wide open spaces beneath the burning sky. Sand covered footprints within minutes. Sometimes entire sections of road vanished overnight beneath new drifts. Small crews lived in isolated huts near these routes. Their lives were quiet and difficult. Water had to be carried carefully and protected from heat. Food arrived only occasionally from nearby towns. At night they slept beneath heavy silence broken only by distant wind across the dunes. Yet each morning they walked the roads again. Searching for buried markers. clearing narrow paths, restoring direction across the empty land. Travelers depended upon them without often knowing their names. A merchant leading donkeys through the desert might simply notice that the route remained visible. Stone markers appeared where expected. The road ahead still existed. And somewhere nearby, beneath the rising sun, road workers continued sweeping sand aside once more. Back near the Nile, life moved with gentler rhythms. Afternoon shadows slowly lengthened across courtyards and narrow streets. Women ground grain using heavy stones while children carried water jars from public wells. Fishermen repaired torn nets beside the riverbank. Potters shaped wet clay beneath shaded workshops where air remained cooler. Dust floated softly through beams of sunlight. The roads were never truly clean now by this hour. Thin layers of sand already covered many surfaces again. Cartwheels cut fresh tracks through the powdery ground. Sandals left soft footprints everywhere. Still, because of the morning labor, movement remained possible. The city continued breathing. And as evening approached, the pace of work slowly softened. Road crews finished final sweeping near important buildings before darkness returned. Tools were stacked against walls or carried home across tired shoulders. Workers washed dust from faces and hands using small amounts of precious water. Many returned home quietly beneath skies turning orange and gold above the western desert. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The smell of lentils, onions, and baking bread drifted through the evening air. Families gathered together after the long heat of day. Children spoke sleepily beside doorways while older relatives rested aching knees and backs. Road workers often ate simply. Bread, beer, perhaps dried fish or beans. Their hands remained rough from labor even while holding food. Fine grains of sand stayed trapped within the folds of linen clothing. Dust settled into every part of life here. No one escaped it completely. After supper, some workers sat outside watching darkness slowly return across the Nile Valley. The river reflected fading light while insects hummed softly near reeds along the banks. A cooler breeze sometimes arrived after sunset, bringing brief relief from the heat. People spoke quietly then. Not about great kings or temples, but about ordinary things. A sore shoulder, a broken sandal strap, a child recovering from fever, a cartwheel stuck in deep sand near the market road earlier that morning. Simple lives moved quietly beneath the enormous ancient sky. And always tomorrow waited. Tomorrow the wind would blow again across the desert. Tomorrow sand would drift back into the streets. Tomorrow before dawn, tired workers would rise once more from woven mats and step softly into dark roads carrying brooms worn smooth by endless use. The Nile would continue flowing. Bread ovens would warm again. Donkeys would carry goods through crowded streets. And somewhere beneath the pale light of early morning, the first sound of sweeping would begin once more. Soft, steady, patient, like the breathing of the ancient world itself. Before the first light returned to the eastern horizon, the city rested in a heavy silence once again. Night covered the Nile Valley with deep blue shadows. The desert beyond the river looked almost endless beneath the stars, smooth and pale beneath the moonlight. Wind moved quietly across distant dunes, carrying tiny grains of sand slowly toward the sleeping settlements along the water. Inside the city, rooftops were crowded with sleeping families. Some lay beneath thin linen sheets. Others rested uncovered in the warm night air. The flat roofs of mud brick homes held the day's heat for many hours, but after midnight a softer coolness sometimes drifted in from the river. Children curled close beside parents. Elderly men slept lightly, waking often to shift tired limbs stiff from years of labor. Nearby, oil lamps burned low in small wall niches. A few homes still glowed faintly in the darkness where bakers had already begun preparing dough for morning bread. The smell of yeast and grain floated softly through nearby streets. Somewhere far away, a baby cried briefly before falling quiet again. Most roads were empty now. Only the night watchmen still walked them. These men moved slowly through narrow streets carrying simple staffs and small lamps protected from the wind by clay coverings. Their footsteps echoed softly against stone and packed earth. They watched for thieves, wandering animals, or accidental fires started by cooking embers left burning too long. But even they noticed the sand. Already it gathered again along road edges and against low walls. Tiny ripples formed across empty pathways where the wind had passed during the night. The city seemed almost to disappear beneath dust if one looked carefully enough. The watchman understood what morning would bring. Soon the road workers would return. And before long, the entire slow rhythm of the city would begin again. Near the river docks, fishermen were among the earliest to rise. Some woke while the stars still reflected upon the black surface of the Nile. They rolled up sleeping mats beside tide boats and stretched aching shoulders before beginning another day. The river smelled of wet reeds, mud, and fish. Water moved gently against wooden hulls. Frogs croaked softly somewhere among the marsh grasses. Nets hung from poles like dark shapes against the night sky. The fishermen worked quietly at first. A few checked woven baskets. Others repaired weak sections of netting by lamplight. Some sat silently for several moments before beginning, simply listening to the calm water and enjoying the final coolness before the heat returned. But near the docks, sand had already drifted thickly across the roads again. This mattered immediately. Fish had to reach the markets quickly after sunrise. Merchants carrying baskets needed clear footing near the riverbanks where the ground could already become slippery from mud and spilled water. Donkeys loaded with supplies struggled in deep sand close to the docks. So the first road crews often focused there before anywhere else. The workers arrived carrying broad reed brooms over tired shoulders. Their linen clothing hung loosely in the dim light. Some still looked half asleep as they stepped into the drifting dust. Without speaking much, they began sweeping. The sound blended with the movement of the river. Brush. 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 Sand gathered into pale lines beneath the moonlight. Nearby fishermen nodded quietly in greeting as they passed. Most of these men knew each other well. The same faces appeared every morning beside the Nile. The same labor returned day after day beneath the same enormous sky. Some workers had spent their entire lives near these docks. As boys they carried baskets for older sweepers. As young men they pushed heavy drifts away from loading ramps beneath the burning afternoon sun. Now their hair had turned gray with age, yet still they walked these same roads before dawn. Their hands had become hard like dry wood. Their feet knew every stone beneath the dust. In wealthier homes farther from the river, servants were also beginning to wake. Large houses belonging to officials or merchants required constant cleaning because sand entered everywhere. Even rooms with wooden shutters and woven curtains slowly filled with fine dust carried by the wind. Servants swept floors before sunrise while the household remained asleep. Palm fiber brooms moved softly across smooth stone surfaces. Dust collected beneath beds, along painted walls, and beside carved furniture brought from distant workshops. Open courtyards filled especially quickly because desert wind moved freely through them. Some servants coughed quietly while working. The dust settled deep inside the lungs after many years. Yet no one expected perfect cleanliness. Only temporary order. That was enough. Outside, the city slowly brightened. The eastern horizon turned pale silver behind distant palms. Birds began calling softly from rooftop nests. Donkeys shifted impatiently where they had been tied for the night. Smoke rose from the first cooking fires. And still the road workers swept steadily onward. Along larger avenues, groups of men worked together using wide wooden scrapers to clear deeper layers of drifting sand. These roads connected important areas of the city. Temple supplies moved through them. Government messengers traveled along them. Merchants from nearby villages entered through these routes carrying grain, pottery, cloth, and vegetables. If the roads became too soft beneath the carts, travel slowed immediately. Wheel ruts deepened. Animals tired faster. Tempers grew shorter beneath the heat. So the clearing had to happen early. Before the city fully awakened. The workers understood this rhythm deeply. They moved with steady patience rather than speed. Their labor was part of the city's breathing. The roads were never truly finished. Only maintained for another few hours. Near one broad market street, a young boy walked beside his father carrying a basket nearly half his own size. His small feet disappeared into the dust with every step. He yawned often while trying to stay awake. His father swept carefully near the stone foundations of market stalls. The boy watched him closely. From time to time the older man pointed toward areas where sand gathered thickest after windy nights. He explained how the walls shaped the drifting patterns. He showed which corners needed extra attention before merchants arrived. The boy listened quietly. One day he would likely do the same work alone. Around him, the market slowly came alive. Women arrived balancing baskets upon their heads. Potters rolled carts carrying clay jars toward shaded stalls. A man leading goats moved slowly through the road while muttering softly to the animals. The smell of baking bread grew stronger now. Warm air carried the scent through nearby streets. Bakers removed fresh loaves from clay ovens using long wooden paddles blackened by smoke and heat. Workers passing by often purchased simple round loaves before continuing their labor. Bread and watered beer formed the morning meal for many laborers. Simple food. Heavy enough to continue working. As the sun finally rose above the eastern horizon, golden light spread slowly across the Nile Valley. Temple walls glowed softly beneath the morning brightness. Palm trees cast long thin shadows over roads still half covered in drifting dust. The coolness of night disappeared quickly. Already warmth rose from the earth. Road workers wrapped strips of linen around their heads to shield themselves from the growing heat. Some poured small amounts of water over their necks before returning to work. Others paused briefly beside public wells to drink. The day ahead would be long. In the narrowest streets, the labor became more difficult after sunrise because crowds now filled the roads constantly. Merchants shouted softly while arranging goods. Children carried water jars between homes. Donkeys pushed through busy intersections loaded with baskets and tools. Sand rose into the air with every passing footstep. The workers continued sweeping carefully around moving crowds. Sometimes they cleared paths directly behind passing carts because fresh wheel tracks immediately trapped drifting dust again. The work required endless repetition. Brush. Scrape. Lift. Carry. Repeat. Older workers often developed a slow, careful rhythm that conserved strength. Younger men sometimes worked too quickly early in the day and exhausted themselves before noon. Experience taught patience more than speed. One elderly road cleaner near the Temple district moved with remarkable slowness, yet by midday his section remained clearer than any other. Younger workers sometimes watched him curiously. He understood the wind. He knew where the sand would return first. Instead of fighting every grain, he guided the drifting patterns gently aside. His broom moved almost lazily. Still the road stayed open. Nearby temple servants carried jars of scented oil through freshly cleared courtyards. Priests in white linen walked silently between painted columns while incense drifted upward into warm morning air. Sacred statues stood motionless behind cool stone walls. Yet even here, sand gathered constantly. Workers swept temple entrances many times each day. The desert touched everything. Far beyond the city, farmers were already laboring in fields beside irrigation canals fed by the Nile. The contrast between green farmland and open desert remains striking even after generations of living there. Thick reeds, vegetable gardens, and grain fields flourished beside the river, while only a short distance away dry sand stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Farmers traveled narrow dirt roads between these worlds every day. And these roads too required constant clearing. Canal paths became buried after strong winds. Small bridges disappeared beneath drifting dust. Workers assigned to rural roads walked long distances carrying simple tools across open land where there was little shade. Their labor was lonely compared to the crowded city streets. Only birds, insects, and the distant sounds of water accompanied them. Sometimes they paused beside canals watching sunlight shimmer across the slow-moving river water. Fish occasionally broke the surface before vanishing again into the dark depths below. Then the workers lifted their tools once more and continued walking. In villages farther south along the Nile, children often helped clear roads before school lessons or field work began. Small groups swept pathways leading toward wells and communal ovens. Girls carried baskets filled with sand away from narrow entrances. Boys used branches or rough reed brooms to clear animal tracks through village streets. Their movements seemed almost playful in the cool morning hours. But by midday the heat became serious. The desert sun pressed heavily upon shoulders and backs. Air shimmered above the roads. Dust stuck to damp skin. Lips dried quickly beneath the hot wind. Many workers wrapped cloth over their mouths while sweeping. Still the sand entered everywhere. Eyes. Hair. Food. Water jars. Beds. It became part of life itself. Near midday, the busiest roads grew quieter for a short time as many people retreated indoors to escape the strongest heat. Markets slowed. Animals rested beneath whatever shade they could find. Even the road workers paused more often now. Some sat beside walls eating onions and bread while staring silently at the dusty streets before them. Others slept briefly in narrow strips of shade cast by buildings or carts. The city moved slowly during these hours. Only the wind continued steadily. Sometimes strong gusts swept suddenly through open streets carrying fresh waves of sand across roads cleaned only moments earlier. Workers shielded their eyes while dust spun around them in pale clouds. Then slowly the air settled again. And once more the sweeping began. In workshops near the edge of the city, craftsmen battled sand constantly while trying to complete delicate tasks. Scribes brushed dust from papyrus scrolls before writing. Jewelers covered unfinished work carefully at night. Potters protected wet clay from blowing sand that could ruin smooth surfaces. Road conditions mattered deeply to these craftsmen. Merchants needed safe transport for fragile goods. Heavy drifts made carts unstable. Broken pottery and damaged tools cost valuable time and resources. So many workshops hired their own workers to clear nearby roads and entrances daily. Throughout the afternoon the sounds of sweeping drifted softly through the city. Not loud. Not harsh. Only steady. A quiet scraping beneath the distant calls of merchants and the slow movement of everyday life. As evening approached, the heat finally began to soften. Long shadows stretched once more across the roads. Workers straightened tired backs and rubbed sore hands coated in fine pale dust. The city exhaled. Children reappeared in the streets laughing softly while chasing each other between market stalls. Cooking fires filled the air with the smell of lentils, fish, and fresh bread. The Nile reflected orange light beneath the lowering sun. Many road workers completed one final careful sweep near important roads before returning home. Their bodies ached deeply now. Sandals had rubbed blisters against tired feet. Dust coated their skin beneath layers of sweat. Some coughed quietly after breathing drifting sand all day long. Still tomorrow awaited. It always did. The workers knew that by morning the roads would already begin disappearing again beneath the patient movement of the desert wind. Yet there was comfort in the routine too. The same roads. The same river. The same slow rising of the sun above the Nile Valley. And after supper, when darkness finally returned and cooler air drifted softly through the streets, many workers climbed quietly onto their rooftops to sleep once more beneath the stars. Below them, the roads rested in silence. For a little while. Until the wind began moving again across the ancient land. The desert wind arrived quietly sometime after midnight. At first it moved gently across the western sands beyond the Nile Valley, brushing over dry hills and empty stretches of open land where no trees grew and no water flowed. The dunes shifted almost silently beneath the moonlight. Tiny grains rolled slowly down soft slopes, gathering into new shapes that would be gone again by morning. Then the wind traveled eastward. Across abandoned stone quarries. Across narrow animal paths. Across sleeping fields resting beside dark irrigation canals. And finally into the towns and cities built along the riverbanks. The people sleeping there barely noticed it. Families rested on rooftops beneath thin blankets while warm air moved softly around them. A few turned in their sleep as fine dust settled quietly across linen clothing and woven mats. Clay jars standing near stairways gathered thin coats of sand during the night. Palm leaves rustled faintly above silent courtyards. The city remained peaceful. Yet slowly, steadily, the roads disappeared again. Sand drifted through narrow alleys between mud brick homes. It gathered beneath market stalls and around stone steps. Thin layers spread across temple courtyards where workers had swept carefully only hours earlier. The desert always returned. Before dawn, while darkness still covered the Nile Valley, a single lamp flickered inside a small house near the southern edge of the city. The home belonged to a road sweeper named Mena, a quiet man whose family had cleared roads for generations. The room was simple. Mud brick walls. Low wooden stools. A woven basket hanging beside the doorway. The faint smell of smoke from last night's cooking fire still lingered in the air. Mena opened his eyes slowly. For a few moments he listened to the silence around him. He heard the soft breathing of his children sleeping nearby and the distant bark of a dog somewhere outside. His body felt heavy from yesterday's labor. His shoulders ached before he had even stood up. Still, the day had already begun. He sat upright carefully and rubbed sand from his face. Fine dust had settled across everything during the night. It rested along the floor edges, inside folded blankets, even upon the small clay bowls stacked beside the wall. His wife stirred quietly beside the dying oil lamp. Without many words she handed him a piece of flat bread left from the evening meal. Mena ate slowly while fastening simple linen cloth around his waist. Outside, the air felt cooler than it would later. But the smell of dust already lingered in the wind. Mena stepped into the dark street carrying his broom over one shoulder. The broom had been repaired many times over the years. The wooden handle was smooth from constant use, polished by rough hands and drifting sand. Other workers emerged from nearby homes as well. Shadowed figures moving quietly through sleeping streets. Some greeted each other softly. Others remained silent, saving energy for the long morning ahead. Together they walked toward the central roads near the market district where drifting sand gathered thickest during the night. The stars still shone above the city. The Nile beyond the buildings reflected pale strips of moonlight through the darkness. Somewhere along the riverbank, fishermen were already preparing their boats. The workers reached the market road just as the first faint gray light appeared far in the east. Sand covered much of the street again. Thin dunes leaned against walls and wooden stall frames. Footpaths cleared yesterday had almost vanished beneath fresh layers of dust carried by the wind. Mena looked over the road calmly. There was no frustration in his face. Only recognition. This was simply how the world worked. Without speaking, the workers spread out across the street and began sweeping. The sound rose softly into the dawn. Brush. 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 The rhythm remained slow and steady. No one hurried. Quick movements only wasted strength before the heat arrived. The men worked with practiced patience, pushing sand into long narrow piles along the roadside. As they swept, the city slowly awakened around them. A woman stepped outside carrying a clay water jar balanced carefully against her hip. She paused briefly to sweep the sand away from her doorway before walking toward the public well. Nearby, a baker opened the clay seal of his oven and fed fresh reeds into the fire. Warm orange light flickered across the dusty road. Soon the smell of rising bread drifted into the cool morning air. Mena continued sweeping. Dust clung to his feet and ankles. Tiny grains slipped inside his sandals with every step. He barely noticed anymore. He had known this feeling since childhood. As the eastern sky brightened, more workers entered the streets. Donkeys appeared carrying baskets of vegetables from nearby farms. Potters rolled heavy carts loaded with fresh clay jars. Scribes hurried toward temple offices holding papyrus scrolls close against the dust. The roads needed to be ready before the crowds thickened. Mena and the others worked carefully around stone wheel ruts left by yesterday's carts. Sand collected deeply inside these tracks during windy nights, making travel difficult for heavily loaded wagons. Two younger workers used wooden scrapers to loosen packed sand while older men swept the lighter dust aside. The labor required strength but also attention. Poorly cleared roads quickly became uneven again once traffic returned. The workers understood every curve and hollow beneath the sand. They knew where wheels became trapped after storms. They knew which corners filled fastest when the western wind grew strong. Years of labor had taught them the language of drifting dust. Farther north near the temple district, another group of workers cleaned broad stone pathways leading toward massive gates painted in faded reds and blues. Priests preferred clean entrances for the morning rituals. Temple officials expected order. But even here, beneath enormous carved columns and sacred statues, sand gathered endlessly. The workers swept around the feet of stone gods worn smooth by centuries of wind. Dust settled inside carved hieroglyphs. Thin layers covered painted floors before sunrise each day. One elderly sweeper named Hori paused briefly beside a temple wall to rest his back. He had worked these roads for more than 40 years. His hair was white now. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted heavy baskets. Yet every morning he still arrived before dawn carrying the same broom repaired countless times with fresh reeds and leather strips. Young workers respected him quietly. Hori understood the roads better than anyone. He could study drifting sand for only a moment and know how the wind had moved during the night. Sometimes temple officials asked his advice before placing new walls or market stalls because he knew where sand would gather afterward. But despite his knowledge, even Hori could not stop the desert completely. No one could. As the sun rose higher, heat slowly returned to the city. Warm light spread across rooftops and courtyards. Palm trees cast long shadows over dusty roads. Birds circled above the riverbank searching for scraps near the docks. The workers continued steadily. Sweat darkened their linen clothing. Sand stuck to damp skin and gathered in the folds around their eyes. Some wrapped cloth across their mouths while sweeping deeper drifts near open intersections. Nearby, life unfolded in familiar rhythms. Women knelt beside grinding stones preparing grain for bread. Children carried baskets through narrow alleys. Merchants arranged figs, onions, fish, and jars of oil beneath shaded market coverings. Everywhere people walked upon roads shaped by the morning labor of the sweepers. Most barely thought about it. The roads simply existed. Yet without the endless work beneath the rising sun, movement through the city would slowly become impossible. Near midday, the heat grew intense. The air itself seemed heavy. Stone walls radiated warmth into narrow streets where little wind reached. Dust shimmered above the roads beneath the bright white sky. Workers slowed their movements carefully to conserve strength. Men rested briefly beneath a cloth canopy beside the market road. He drank warm water from a small clay jar and rubbed aching wrists while watching people pass. Across the street, an old donkey stood motionless beside a cart loaded with grain sacks. Its eyes remained half closed against the glare. Flies drifted lazily around its ears. Nearby, a group of children played quietly beside a shaded wall, drawing shapes into the dust with small sticks. Even in rest, the sand remained present everywhere. A warm gust moved suddenly through the street. Fine dust lifted from the road edges and drifted back across the freshly cleared ground. Mena watched it calmly. Then he stood again. Around him, the other workers also returned to their labor. Brooms scraped softly against stone and packed earth once more. Brush. 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 The sound seemed almost endless. In wealthier districts, servants spent much of the afternoon cleaning sand from interior courtyards and shaded gardens. Large homes often contained decorative pools and painted walls that owners tried carefully to protect from drifting dust. Still the sand entered through every opening. Servants swept polished floors repeatedly throughout the day. Linen curtains were shaken clean in courtyards. Cushions and sleeping mats collected dust constantly despite careful attention. One servant girl no older than 13 moved slowly through a shaded hallway carrying a small reed broom. Sunlight entered through carved stone windows, revealing tiny grains floating endlessly through the air like pale smoke. She swept quietly while the household rested during the afternoon heat. Outside the city walls, caravans approached along desert roads from distant settlements. Traders traveled slowly with donkeys carrying copper tools, woven cloth, dried fish, and precious oils. Their faces and clothing were coated in pale desert dust after many days beneath the open sky. The condition of the roads mattered greatly to them. Deep drifting sand exhausted animals quickly and damaged wooden cart wheels. Travelers therefore watched carefully for signs that road crews had recently cleared difficult sections ahead. Sometimes caravan leaders offered small gifts of dates or dried meat to workers maintaining the outer roads. These gestures were simple but appreciated. The desert was difficult for everyone. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, shadows lengthened across the city once more. The harsh brightness softened. A faint breeze drifted inward from the Nile carrying the smell of wet reeds and river mud. Workers began finishing their final tasks before darkness returned. Mena and his crew cleared the market road one last time, pushing scattered sand away from the busiest paths before merchants closed their stalls for the night. Nearby, shopkeepers folded cloth coverings and gathered unsold goods into storage baskets. The sounds of the market faded gradually into softer evening conversations. Children carried water home for supper. Cooking fires flickered to life. Smoke rose gently into the golden evening sky. Mena leaned upon his broom for a moment, studying the road stretching quietly before him. For now it looked almost clean. Hard-packed earth showed clearly beneath the fading light. Footpaths remained open between the stalls. Tomorrow morning it would be different again. But tonight the work was finished. At least for a little while. He lifted the broom onto his shoulder and began the walk home through slowly darkening streets. Other workers moved beside him in tired silence. Their bodies ached deeply now after another day beneath the sun. Yet there was comfort in returning home at dusk. The city smelled of bread and lentil stew. Families gathered together beneath soft evening light. And somewhere beyond the rooftops, the Nile continued flowing quietly through the ancient land while the first night wind began carrying fresh sand slowly toward the sleeping roads once more. Night settled gently over the Nile Valley again. The last colors of sunset faded slowly behind the western desert, leaving long bands of purple and deep blue across the sky. Heat still rose from the roads and stone walls, though the air had become softer now. Palm trees stood motionless in the evening stillness while the river reflected thin silver lines beneath the growing moonlight. One by one, lamps appeared inside homes throughout the city. Warm golden light flickered through doorways and narrow windows covered with woven reed screens. The smell of evening meals drifted through the streets. Lentils simmered slowly in clay pots. Fish roasted over small fires. Fresh bread cooled on flat woven trays beside sleeping dogs and tired children. After the long heat of day, people moved more slowly now. Voices became quieter. Even the donkeys seemed calmer. Mena reached his home carrying his broom across one shoulder. Dust covered nearly every part of him. Pale sand clung to the folds of his linen clothing and settled thickly around his sandals. His hands were dry and rough from gripping the broom handle since before sunrise. His youngest daughter greeted him at the doorway. She smiled sleepily while brushing sand from the step with a tiny reed broom nearly as tall as she was. Mena paused for a moment to watch her careful movements. Even children learned early that sand was never far away. Inside the house, the evening meal waited on low clay dishes placed upon the floor. Bread. Lentils. A few onions soaked in oil. Simple food after a long day. Mena sat slowly, stretching tired legs beneath him. His wife poured watered beer into a small clay cup while their older son spoke softly about helping repair a fishing net beside the river earlier that afternoon. The room remained warm despite the darkness outside. Dust rested quietly along the wall edges where it had already gathered again during the day. A broom leaned beside the doorway ready for tomorrow morning. Everything in the home carried traces of labor. Worn baskets. Cracked water jars repaired with resin. Sandals patched many times. And always the fine pale dust settling across it all. After supper, Mena climbed onto the flat roof of the house where cooler air moved gently through the night. Nearby rooftops were filled with other families preparing to sleep beneath the open sky. Soft conversations drifted across the darkness. Somewhere a mother sang quietly to a restless child. Far below, the roads rested in silence. For now. The moonlight revealed faint pale streaks where drifting sand already crossed the streets again. Mena watched them without surprise. The desert never slept. Even while the city rested, wind continued moving softly across the land, carrying tiny grains through every opening and over every wall. Roads cleared so carefully during the day slowly disappeared beneath fresh dust before morning ever arrived. Yet no one expected permanence. Only continuation. The same roads would be swept again tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. The rhythm had existed longer than memory. Near the northern gate of the city, a smaller crew of night workers remained awake even now. These men handled roads used by late travelers arriving after sunset. Merchant caravans sometimes reached the city walls long after the heat of day had passed, preferring cooler travel beneath the stars. Tonight a line of donkeys approached slowly from the western desert carrying baskets of salt, dried fish, and rough-woven cloth. Their feet moved carefully through soft drifting sand outside the gate. The caravan leader wore a linen cloth wrapped tightly around his face against the dust. Fine grains covered his eyelashes and beard. Behind him, the animals breathed heavily after many days crossing dry open land. The road near the gate required constant clearing because desert winds swept directly through the entrance. Night workers used wide wooden scrapers beneath torchlight while watching the slow arrival of the caravan. The scraping sounds echoed softly against the walls. Torch smoke drifted upward into the dark sky. One younger worker paused briefly to stretch his aching back while studying the arriving travelers. He wondered what it might feel like to leave the city behind and cross endless desert roads toward distant places. But then another gust of wind pushed fresh sand against the gate entrance. The worker lowered his scraper and continued. Every place had its labor. Inside the city, silence deepened as more people fell asleep. The Nile moved quietly beyond the houses. Boats tied along the banks rocked gently in the darkness. Nets hanging from poles swayed faintly in the night breeze. Fishermen sleeping beside the river would rise again soon. The hours before dawn passed quickly in ancient Egypt. Long before sunrise, the first workers began waking once more. In one narrow street near the pottery workshops, an elderly widow named Tia rose carefully from her sleeping mat. Her joints ached badly during cooler night hours, and she moved slowly in the darkness while lighting a small oil lamp. She lived alone now in a tiny mud brick home beside one of the dustiest roads in the city. Every morning before sunrise she swept the path outside her doorway. No one required her to do it. But she believed a clean entrance honored both the living and the dead. So even with tired hands and bent shoulders, she performed the same quiet task each day. Tia opened her wooden door. Cool darkness greeted her. The street outside lay silent beneath fading stars. Sand had drifted deeply against the lower walls overnight. Thin ripples stretched across the road where the wind had moved through the alley. The old woman began sweeping gently. Brush. 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 The sound seemed very small beneath the enormous ancient sky. Yet soon other sounds joined it. A distant oven door opening. Footsteps near the river. A donkey stirring in its sleep. The city was waking again. Farther east, the first road crews gathered beside a public well before beginning their morning routes. Mena stood among them holding his broom while rubbing sleep from tired eyes. Nearby workers drank quickly from clay cups before the day's heat returned. No one spoke loudly at this hour. Voices remained soft and low. The eastern horizon slowly brightened behind distant palm trees. Thin gray light spread across rooftops while stars disappeared one by one above the desert. Then the workers stepped into the roads once more. Today the wind had been stronger during the night. Sand lay thick across many streets near the market district. Some paths had nearly vanished completely beneath fresh drifts. Wheel tracks left yesterday were gone now, hidden beneath smooth pale layers stretching from wall to wall. The younger workers sighed quietly at the sight. But older men simply nodded and began. They had seen worse before. Together the crew spread through the streets carrying brooms, baskets, and wooden scrapers. Dust rose softly around their feet as the first sweeping of the morning began. The labor felt endless sometimes. Still there was comfort inside its repetition. The workers knew exactly what to do. Hands moved automatically. Bodies followed familiar rhythms learned over many years. Near the bakery quarter, warm firelight glowed from open ovens while bakers shaped dough upon wooden boards dusted heavily with flour. The smell of rising bread filled the roads long before sunrise fully arrived. Road workers often paused briefly near these bakeries during the earliest hours. The warmth from the ovens felt comforting against cool morning air. Some purchased small loaves using copper pieces earned from yesterday's labor. A baker named Painassi greeted Mena quietly while sliding fresh bread from the oven using a long wooden paddle darkened by smoke and heat. "You will clear the market road first today," the baker said softly. Mena nodded. The wind buried it deeply. The baker sighed gently while wiping flour from his hands. "It always does." Neither man sounded angry. Only tired. Outside, the city continued brightening. Birds gathered along rooftop edges calling softly into the morning air. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires. Women carrying water jars stepped carefully through half-cleared roads while children still wrapped in sleepiness followed behind them. The workers swept steadily onward. As sunlight finally touched the tops of the temple walls, golden light spread slowly through the streets. Dust floated visibly now in the brightening air, drifting like pale mist above the roads. Mena worked beside two younger sweepers near the central market entrance. They pushed large piles of sand toward the road edges before merchants arrived with carts and animals. One of the younger men, barely older than a boy, wiped sweat from his forehead. "Do you think the roads were always like this?" he asked quietly. Mena continued sweeping for a moment before answering. "My father said his father asked the same thing." The boy smiled faintly. Then all three returned to work. Nearby, merchants began opening their stalls. Wooden shutters creaked softly. Clay jars were arranged carefully upon woven mats. Baskets of dates, onions, fish, and lentils appeared beneath cloth coverings meant to soften the growing sun. Soon the roads would become crowded again. Already footsteps multiplied around them. Yet beneath all the sounds of waking city life, the steady brushing of brooms continued. Always patient. Always repeating. By mid-morning, heat gathered quickly across the Nile Valley. The cool softness of dawn vanished beneath the rising sun. Stone walls warmed beneath bright light. Dust clung to damp skin. Flies circled lazily through the air near market stalls. The workers slowed slightly to preserve energy. Road clearing was not work that could be rushed for long. Mena paused beside a shaded wall and watched sunlight shimmer above the distant river. Boats moved slowly through the glare while fishermen lifted wet nets sparkling briefly in the brightness. Beyond them stretched the green farmland fed by the Nile. And beyond that waited the desert. Silent. Endless. Always sending more sand toward the roads of the living city. Mena lifted his broom again. Around him, the streets continued filling with merchants, servants, scribes, children, and animals moving through the drifting dust of another ancient day. By the middle of the morning, the city had fully awakened beneath the growing heat of the Egyptian sun. The roads that had seemed peaceful before dawn were now crowded with movement. Sandals brushed softly across packed earth. Wooden cartwheels creaked through narrow streets. Donkeys carrying grain baskets lowered their heads beneath the weight while drivers guided them carefully around deeper patches of sand. Dust floated constantly through the warm air. No matter how much sweeping had already been done, the roads still carried the feeling of the desert upon them. Thin pale layers covered the ground between every footprint and wheel track. Wind moved slowly around corners, lifting grains into tiny spirals before letting them settle once again. Mena worked steadily near the center of the market district. The sun climbed higher above the rooftops now, and sweat darkened the cloth wrapped around his shoulders. Sand clung to the damp skin of his arms. His broom moved with calm repetition, pushing dust away from the busiest pathways before merchants became too crowded together. Around him, the market slowly filled with sound. Not loud sound. Not harshness. Only the soft, endless noise of ordinary life. Merchants greeted familiar customers beneath hanging cloth shades. Pottery jars knocked gently together while being arranged upon wooden stands. Women examined bundles of onions and garlic tied with reeds. Children wandered sleepily beside parents carrying baskets almost too large for their small arms. A fisherman passed through the road carrying fresh river fish wrapped in damp cloth. The smell of the Nile followed him briefly through the dry dusty air. Nearby, a scribe walked carefully while protecting rolled papyrus beneath one arm. Sand could ruin ink quickly if it entered the delicate fibers. He frowned slightly while stepping around drifting dust gathered near a broken wall. Mena noticed the movement without looking directly. After so many years working the roads, he could sense where people walked even while focused on sweeping. His body understood the rhythm of the streets. Brush. Step. Turn. Sweep again. The motions no longer required thought. Across the market road, another crew worked near the public well where sand gathered heavily around the stone edges during windy nights. Women lined up quietly with water jars balanced against their hips while the workers cleared narrow paths through the drifting dust. One older woman thanked them softly as she passed. Most people rarely spoke to the sweepers. Not from cruelty. Simply because the labor had become part of the background of life itself. Like ovens baking bread. Like river water moving south to north. Like wind carrying sand from the desert. The workers were always there. Near the well, a young sweeper named Cassis struggled with a heavy wooden scraper while trying to clear packed sand from a deep cart rut. He was still new to the labor and often pushed too hard too quickly beneath the sun. An older worker beside him noticed immediately. "Slow your arms," the man said quietly without stopping his own sweeping. "The road will still be here tomorrow." Casa nodded and adjusted his pace. The older workers understood something the younger men often learned only after years beneath the heat. Strength disappeared quickly in Egypt. The sun demanded patience. By late morning the air itself seemed filled with brightness. White sunlight reflected from stone walls and pale dust until the entire city appeared wrapped in warm haze. Workers tied additional linen cloth across their heads and necks. Some dipped strips of fabric into water jars before wrapping them around tired shoulders. Still the heat entered everything. Homes. Workshops. Roads. Even shaded areas held warmth trapped inside mud brick walls from previous days. Near the temple district, priests walked slowly through stone courtyards carrying bowls of incense while servants swept dust from painted floors. Sand gathered endlessly along the edges of carved pillars despite constant cleaning. One servant spent nearly the entire morning brushing fine grains from the paws of a large stone lion statue near the entrance gate. By afternoon, the sand would begin returning again. Nothing stayed clean for long. Farther south, near the edge of the city where workshops crowded together beside narrow roads, the dust became thicker still. Potters shaped wet clay while clouds of pale powder drifted through the sunlight outside. Carpenters sawed wood beneath shaded roofs. Copper workers hammered metal slowly in the heat while sweat rolled down their backs. Road sweepers moved constantly through these streets because heavy workshop traffic churned sand into deeper layers. Broken pottery fragments mixed with dust beneath sandals. Animal tracks crossed over wheel ruts. Children carrying scraps of wood for cooking fires ran carefully between carts and donkeys. The city breathed through these roads. Without them, nothing moved smoothly. And always the sweepers remained there, keeping the paths open one careful stroke at a time. Near midday, the first signs of exhaustion began appearing across the market district. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Merchants sat more often beneath hanging cloth shades while waiting for customers. Dogs stretched beneath carts searching for cooler ground. Even flies seemed to drift lazily through the thick warm air. Menno paused beside a wall darkened by years of dust and smoke. He drank slowly from a clay water jar while studying the road before him. Already the path he had cleared at sunrise carried new layers of drifting sand. Not thick enough yet to stop traffic, but enough to notice. Enough to remind him that the work never truly ended. A warm wind moved through the market then. Light at first. Gentle enough to stir hanging cloths and lift dust from the road edges. But Menno recognized the feeling immediately. The western wind was strengthening again. Across the city, older sweepers noticed it too. They looked toward the desert horizon beyond the rooftops where pale haze already drifted above distant dry hills. The younger workers continued sweeping normally for a while longer. Then the wind arrived more fully. It pushed through the streets in slow warm waves carrying fresh dust with it. Sand lifted from open ground outside the city walls and moved inward through every road and alley. Tiny grains struck against stone surfaces with soft dry sounds. Shhhhhhh. Merchants quickly covered baskets of grain and fruit with linen cloths. Potters protected unfinished clay work inside shaded rooms. Women held scarves across their faces while crossing open streets. The sweepers lowered their heads and continued working. This part of the labor demanded endurance more than strength. Sand moved constantly around their ankles now, sliding back across freshly cleared ground almost as quickly as the brooms could push it aside. Still they swept. Brush. 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 The rhythm never stopped. Cassis struggled beside the market well as wind pushed dust directly into his eyes. He blinked repeatedly while trying to keep his scraper steady. The older worker beside him handed over a length of linen cloth. "Wrap your face," he said quietly. Casa obeyed without speaking. Soon many of the workers looked almost ghost-like beneath layers of dust-covered cloth and drifting sand. Only their tired eyes remained visible above wrapped faces. The city itself seemed softer during these windy hours. More distant. Shapes blurred behind pale moving dust. Yet life continued. A woman still carried bread home through the market. Children still chased one another between shaded stalls. Fishermen still repaired nets beside the riverbank where wind rippled across the water. And the sweepers continued clearing roads through it all. By the hottest part of the afternoon, much of the city retreated indoors. Workshop doors closed halfway against the blowing sand. Merchants rested beneath cloth canopies while sipping watered beer. Families gathered in shaded rooms where thick mud brick walls trapped a little coolness from the night before. Only essential labor continued beneath the strongest heat. The road workers remained outside. Menno moved more slowly now. His shoulders ached deeply with every push of the broom. Sand rubbed painfully against the skin inside his sandals. His throat felt dry even after drinking water. Yet he continued. Nearby, Hori, the elderly temple sweeper, worked with the same steady rhythm he had carried for decades. His movements remained calm despite the heat and blowing dust. Younger workers sometimes wondered how he endured it. But Hori no longer fought the day. He accepted it. The wind. The heat. The endless returning sand. Acceptance made the labor quieter inside the mind. Late in the afternoon, the western wind finally began to weaken. Dust settled slowly back onto the roads. The bright harsh glare softened into warmer colors as the sun lowered toward the desert hills. People returned gradually to the streets. Market stalls reopened fully. Children emerged from shaded homes. Donkeys once again carried goods through the roads now lined with fresh layers of pale dust from the afternoon wind. The sweepers began their evening clearing. This final labor before sunset mattered greatly because night travelers still needed safe paths through the city. Merchants closing stalls required smoother roads for carts. Families walking toward the riverbanks after supper preferred firmer footing beneath the fading light. Mena and his crew worked carefully through the market district one last time. The roads looked tired. The workers looked tired too. But together they restored a little order before darkness returned. As sunset spread orange light across the Nile Valley, long shadows stretched over the dusty streets. Palm trees swayed gently beside the river. Birds crossed the glowing sky while smoke from evening fires drifted upward through the warm air. The city softened once more. Merchants packed away remaining goods. Temple bells echoed faintly in the distance. The smell of bread and lentils returned to the roads. Mena leaned briefly upon his broom and watched the evening light settle across the market. The road before him was not perfectly clean. It never would be. But it was open. People could walk. Carts could move. Tomorrow morning the city would wake again and continue breathing through these same dusty paths. For now, that was enough. He lifted the broom onto his shoulder and began the slow walk home while the first coolness of evening drifted inward from the quiet dark waters of the Nile. The evening breeze moved softly through the city as darkness slowly returned across the Nile Valley. After the harsh brightness of the day, the world seemed quieter now. Dust settled gently onto roads still warm from the sun. The market stalls stood half-covered in shadow while merchants carried the last baskets of grain and vegetables back into storage rooms behind woven reed doors. Mena walked home beside other road workers through the dimming streets. No one spoke very much. The labor of the day still rested heavily inside their bodies. Their shoulders ached from lifting scrapers and baskets. Their hands carried small cracks from dry wood handles and constant dust. Sand remained trapped inside their sandals no matter how often they emptied them. The workers moved slowly beneath the evening sky. Ahead of them, smoke rose from cooking fires in thin gray lines. The smell of onions cooking in oil drifted through the roads along with the softer scent of warm bread cooling after a long day of baking. Children played quietly near doorways while waiting for supper. Dogs wandered between homes searching for scraps. Somewhere nearby, someone played a small reed flute very softly. The sound floated through the warm air for a few moments before fading into the night. The city no longer felt hurried. Darkness had a way of slowing everything. Mena reached his home just after the last light disappeared behind the western desert. His wife had already lit a small oil lamp inside the main room. The weak flame painted gentle shadows across the mud brick walls while insects circled lazily near the light. Tonight the evening meal was simple again. Bread. Beans. A few dried dates shared carefully among the family. Mena's son sat nearby repairing a broken sandal strap with thin leather strips while listening to his father describe the strong wind that had swept through the market district earlier that afternoon. The sand covered the road near the well almost completely, Mena said quietly. His son nodded. He had seen similar storms many times already despite his young age. In Egypt, children learned quickly that roads belonged partly to the desert no matter how often they were cleared. After supper, Mena carried a clay water jar onto the roof and sat beneath the open sky. The air felt cooler now. A faint breeze drifted inward from the Nile carrying the smell of wet reeds and river mud. Across the city, thousands of families rested upon rooftops just like this one. Soft conversations floated through the darkness between neighboring homes. Some people spoke about work in the fields. Others discussed sick relatives or grain prices at the market. Many simply sat quietly after the long heat of day, too tired for many words. Far away, temple fires flickered faintly against the night horizon. The desert beyond remained silent beneath the moonlight. Mena leaned back slowly and closed his eyes for a moment. Even now, he could still feel the motion of sweeping inside his arms. Brush. Step. Turn. Sweep again. The rhythm followed him everywhere. Below the rooftops, the roads rested in pale silver moonlight. Thin layers of sand had already begun drifting back across them. Near the city gates, the night workers continued their labor beneath torches mounted along the walls. Wind from the open desert moved more freely there, carrying fresh dust through the entrances hour after hour. Tonight several travelers arrived late from a northern farming village carrying baskets of onions and bundles of flax tied carefully with rope. Their donkeys looked exhausted. Dust coated the animals from head to tail after the long journey. The travelers themselves walked slowly with tired eyes and dry lips cracked from heat and wind. One older traveler paused beside a road worker clearing sand near the gate. "You sweep this every night?" he asked quietly. The worker nodded while pushing another line of sand aside with his scraper. "And every morning," he answered. The traveler looked toward the dark desert beyond the walls. "It must feel endless." The worker rested both hands upon the scraper handle for a moment. "It is endless," he said softly. Then he returned to work. The traveler watched him briefly before leading the donkeys deeper into the sleeping city. As the night continued, silence settled more heavily across the roads. Even the market district became still now. Empty stalls stood quietly beneath cloth coverings while stray dogs curled beneath wooden carts. Only the wind remained awake. It moved softly through narrow alleys and open courtyards. Tiny grains of sand scraped gently against walls and doorways. Dust gathered once more along wheel tracks and stone steps. The desert always returned patiently. Never hurried. Never tired. Hours later, long before sunrise, the city slowly began waking again. The first sound came from the bakeries. Wood cracked softly inside clay ovens as fires were lit in the darkness. Sparks drifted upward through open roof holes while bakers mixed grain and water inside large bowls worn smooth by years of use. Soon after, fishermen stirred beside the riverbanks. The Nile remained black beneath the stars, calm and slow-moving. Boats rocked gently against wooden posts while fishermen folded sleeping mats and prepared nets for the morning. The smell of river water mixed with damp mud and fish scales carried faintly through nearby streets. And then the road workers began rising once more. Mena opened his eyes before dawn to the familiar ache in his shoulders and lower back. For a few quiet moments he listened to the sleeping city around him. A dog barking far away. Wind brushing softly against rooftop edges. Someone coughing in a neighboring house. Then he sat upright and reached for his broom. The wood felt cool in the darkness. He climbed carefully down from the rooftop while his family still slept nearby beneath thin linen sheets. Inside the house, the oil lamp had nearly burned out. Only a weak orange glow remained beside the wall. Mena ate a small piece of bread left from the evening meal and drank water slowly from a clay jar. Outside, the roads were dark and silent once again. Moonlight revealed pale drifts gathered along the market road. Sand had blown deeply against several walls during the night wind. In some places footprints from yesterday evening had completely disappeared beneath fresh dust. Other workers emerged quietly from nearby homes. Shadowed figures carrying brooms and scrapers through the darkness. The city belonged to them during these early hours. Before merchants. Before priests. Before the crowded movement of daytime. Near the public well, Mena joined several workers preparing to clear the central roads before sunrise. One younger man yawned heavily while tightening cloth around his head against the cool morning wind. Another rubbed sore wrists before lifting his scraper. No one complained much anymore. Complaints changed nothing. The work remained. Together they stepped into the market district. The stars still hung overhead while the first faint gray light touched the eastern horizon. Dust shifted softly around their sandals as they spread through the roads and began sweeping once more. Brush. 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 The sound echoed gently between the sleeping buildings. Nearby, Tia, the elderly widow, had already begun clearing the small path outside her doorway again. Her movements were slower now than in younger years, yet still careful and steady. She swept every morning before the city awakened. Some habits became part of the soul after enough years. Farther away near the temple district, Hori worked beneath torchlight beside enormous stone columns rising into the darkness. Sand covered parts of the entrance road once again after yesterday's wind. Hori moved calmly with his familiar rhythm. Young workers nearby sometimes rushed too quickly at the start of the day, eager to finish before sunrise. But Hori never hurried. He understood something important. The desert could not be defeated through force. Only met with patience. As dawn slowly brightened over the Nile Valley, more sounds joined the sweeping. Birds called from palm trees. Donkeys stirred beside market carts. Women stepped into the roads carrying empty water jars toward the wells. The city was waking. Warm light spread gradually across rooftops and temple walls. Dust floated visibly now in the pale golden air. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward while the smell of fresh bread returned once more to the streets. Mena cleared a path near the market entrance while watching the first merchants arrive with baskets balanced across their shoulders. One merchant nodded toward the freshly swept road. "You were here early," he said. Mena smiled faintly. "We are always here early." The merchant laughed softly and continued walking. Soon the roads filled again with ordinary life. Children carrying baskets. Scribes protecting papyrus from drifting dust. Farmers leading donkeys through crowded intersections. Servants hurrying between homes. And beneath it all, the endless quiet labor of the sweepers continued. The sun rose higher. Heat slowly returned. Fresh sand moved already along the road edges beneath the morning breeze. Another ancient day had begun beside the Nile. As the morning continued, sunlight spread fully across the Nile Valley and washed the city in pale gold. The coolness of dawn disappeared quickly beneath the rising heat. Roads that had seemed soft and quiet only an hour earlier were now alive with movement. Sandals shuffled through drifting dust. Wooden wheels groaned beneath heavy carts. Merchants called softly to familiar customers while arranging their goods beneath hanging cloth shades that fluttered gently in the warm breeze. Mena worked near the center of the market road again. The sweeping had become part of his breathing over the years. His broom moved almost without thought now, pushing thin waves of sand toward the edges of the street while crowds slowly thickened around him. Dust rose into the sunlight with every stroke. Tiny grains floated through the air like pale smoke before settling once more upon the roads, the walls, the baskets, the faces of passing strangers. Nothing remained untouched. Nearby, a young girl walked carefully beside her mother carrying a basket of figs balanced against her hip. Her bare feet disappeared into the soft dust with each step. When she reached a freshly swept section of road, she paused briefly and looked down at the hard-packed earth beneath the sand. "It looks cleaner here," she whispered. Her mother smiled faintly. "The sweepers came early today." Then they continued toward the market stalls while the girl glanced back once more at Mena and the other workers. Most people rarely thought about the roads until they became difficult to cross. But children noticed many things adults no longer saw. Near the southern workshops, the roads had already become crowded with laborers carrying tools and supplies through the growing heat. Potters rolled carts loaded with clay jars toward open-air kilns. Carpenters carried cedar planks imported from distant lands. Stone workers dragged sledges across dusty streets while sweat darkened the linen wrapped around their shoulders. Every movement stirred more dust into the air. The road sweepers followed constantly behind the busiest traffic. Some carried wide reed brooms while others pushed heavy wooden scrapers through deeper drifts left by cart wheels. Younger workers hauled baskets of sand toward empty lots beside the city walls where the wind would eventually scatter it once again. The labor never truly removed the sand. It only moved it from one place to another for a little while. By mid-morning, the sun had grown bright enough to force many people into the narrow strips of shade beside walls and market coverings. Dogs rested beneath carts with tired eyes half closed against the glare. Donkeys flicked their ears lazily while standing beside water troughs coated in dust. The city moved more slowly now. Even voices softened beneath the heavy warmth. Mena paused beside a pottery stall where a craftsman carefully brushed sand away from freshly painted jars drying in the sunlight. "If the wind grows stronger today, these will all need covering again," the potter said quietly. Mena looked toward the western horizon beyond the rooftops. A faint pale haze already lingered there. "The desert is awake early," he answered. The potter sighed softly. "It never sleeps." Mena nodded once. Then both men returned to their work. Farther north near the river docks, fishermen unloaded the morning catch while sweepers cleared narrow roads leading inland toward the market district. Wet fish scales mixed with drifting sand beneath the workers' feet. The smell of river water hung heavily in the warm air. Boats rocked gently against wooden posts while laborers carried baskets of fish balanced carefully across their shoulders. The roads near the docks required constant attention. Mud from the riverbanks mixed with sand and created deep uneven ground that became difficult for carts and animals. Sweepers used flat wooden boards to level the worst sections while other workers scattered dry sand over damp areas to keep people from slipping. An elderly fisherman watched them quietly while repairing a torn net beneath a shaded awning. "My father used to clear these roads too," he said softly to no one in particular. One of the workers glanced toward him while sweeping. "So did mine." The fisherman smiled faintly. The river changed slowly over time. The roads changed every day. Yet the labor remained the same. Near the temple district, servants moved silently through large stone courtyards carrying jars of water and baskets of incense while priests prepared for midday rituals inside cool shadowed halls. Even here, surrounded by towering columns and painted walls, sand drifted endlessly through the open spaces. Temple sweepers worked carefully along carved pathways where important officials walked during ceremonies. They brushed dust away from painted stone floors and cleared the entrances before the hottest hours of the day arrived. One young temple servant knelt beside a carved stairway using a small hand broom to remove fine sand gathered inside the cracks between stones. The work demanded patience. Tiny grains hid everywhere. No matter how carefully the roads and courtyards were cleaned, wind always carried more dust into the sacred spaces by afternoon. Yet the servants continued quietly. In ancient Egypt, much of life depended upon repeating tasks that could never truly be finished. Bread had to be baked again each day. Water carried again each morning. Roads swept again each sunrise. The repetition itself became comforting. By late morning, the heat pressed heavily upon the city. The sky above the Nile Valley looked pale and almost white with brightness. Stone walls radiated warmth back into the narrow streets. Dust clung to damp skin and settled into the folds of linen clothing. Mena wiped sweat from his forehead while leaning briefly upon his broom. His hands hurt today. The skin along his palms had cracked slightly from dryness and constant friction against the broom handle. Fine grains of sand settled into the small cuts and burned whenever sweat touched them. Still he continued sweeping. Pain belonged to ordinary life here. Most workers carried it quietly. Across the market road, Cassis struggled again with a heavy scraper stuck inside a deep wheel rut packed tightly with sand. He pulled harder, trying to free it quickly. Hori, the elderly temple sweeper, happened to pass nearby carrying his own broom. Without speaking at first, he stepped beside the younger man and pressed one sandaled foot gently against the scraper blade. "Do not fight the road," Hori said softly. "Loosen it first." Together they worked the scraper slowly back and forth until the packed sand gave way. Casa looked embarrassed. Hori only smiled faintly. "The desert is patient," the old man said. "You must learn patience too." Then he continued down the road beneath the growing heat. Casa watched him disappear into the dusty brightness before returning to his work with slower, steadier movements. Around midday, the city reached its quietest moment. Many merchants rested beneath hanging cloth shades while chewing slowly on bread and onions. Workshop doors closed halfway against the glare outside. Families retreated indoors where thick mud brick walls held small traces of coolness left from the night. Even the animals became still. Only the sweepers remained moving steadily through the roads. Their labor slowed now beneath the crushing heat, but it never stopped completely. Mena and several workers rested briefly beside a public wall where narrow strips of shade stretched across the ground. A young worker drank carefully from a clay jar and stared at the drifting dust moving across the road before them. "Do you think there will ever be a day without sand?" he asked quietly. No one answered immediately. At last Mena shook his head. "If the sand vanished," he said softly, "Egypt would not feel like Egypt anymore." The others nodded silently. The desert was difficult. But it was also home. Warm wind moved gently through the road then, carrying the smell of dry earth from beyond the city walls. Fine dust lifted once more into the air. The workers stood again. Brushes scraped softly against the roads. Across the city, ordinary life slowly resumed as the afternoon heat began its long gradual decline. Children reappeared beside doorways. Merchants uncovered baskets and jars. Farmers guided donkeys through the market streets toward the river. And always the sweepers remained there among them. Sometimes nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. Sometimes unnoticed entirely. Yet the roads beneath every footstep depended upon their quiet labor. As the afternoon stretched onward, sunlight softened slightly above the western desert. Long shadows began appearing beneath market stalls and along temple walls. The harsh brightness eased into warmer colors. Mena finished clearing the central market road for what felt like the 100th time that day. Already thin lines of sand crossed the hard-packed earth behind him again. He looked at them calmly. Then he swept once more. Around him, the ancient city continued breathing beneath the slow drifting wind while the Nile flowed quietly nearby, carrying cool dark water through a land of heat, dust, labor, and endless patient mornings. The afternoon light softened slowly across the city as the sun moved lower above the western desert. Long shadows stretched over the roads now. The harsh white brightness of midday faded into warmer tones of gold and pale orange. Dust floating through the air glowed gently in the sunlight, turning the streets hazy and calm. For the workers, these final hours before evening often felt the longest. Their bodies were already tired from labor beneath the heat. Arms ached from hours of sweeping. Sand had rubbed against their skin since before sunrise. Yet the roads still needed attention before darkness returned. Mena moved steadily along the market district with his broom dragging soft lines through the dust. Around him, merchants prepared for the evening crowds that often appeared once the heat became easier to bear. Cloth shades were adjusted. Clay lamps were set near stall entrances ready for sunset. Fresh loaves of bread arrived from the bakeries wrapped in linen still warm from the ovens. The smell drifted through the roads. Warm grain. Smoke. Dust. The familiar scent of another ordinary day in ancient Egypt. Nearby, children played beside a wall where the sweepers had piled small hills of sand gathered from the streets earlier that morning. Tiny hands shaped the dust into rough animals and miniature houses before the wind slowly softened the edges again. An older woman carrying water jars watched them and smiled faintly. "The desert gives them toys," she murmured softly. Mena heard her while sweeping but said nothing. He understood the feeling. In Egypt, even the hardships became woven into daily life so completely that people stopped separating them from ordinary beauty. Farther along the road, a group of donkeys entered the market carrying baskets filled with reeds harvested from marshes near the Nile. Their hooves stirred fresh clouds of pale dust into the evening air while the drivers guided them carefully through crowded streets. The sweepers followed behind almost immediately. Roads near the market entrance became uneven quickly once heavy animals passed through soft drifting sand. Mena and two younger workers pushed fresh piles aside before the evening traffic thickened further. Brush. Brush. Scrape. The sounds blended softly with distant conversations and the low murmur of the market. Across the city near the riverbanks, fishermen prepared for the coming night. Some repaired nets beneath fading sunlight while others pushed small boats into the darkening water. The Nile reflected warm orange colors now beneath the sky. Gentle ripples moved outward from the shore while reeds swayed quietly in the breeze. The roads near the docks remained busy even at this hour. Fish baskets had to reach the evening markets before darkness deepened fully. Workers carried wet nets and heavy clay jars through narrow streets where sand mixed with damp mud beneath their feet. A dock sweeper named Nebu worked slowly near the loading ramps using a wide wooden scraper worn smooth by years beside the river. His knees hurt badly now with age. Every evening the pain grew sharper once the heat began fading from the earth. Still he returned each day. Nebu often said the roads near the river spoke differently from the desert roads deeper inside the city. The docks breathe with the water, he once told Mena many years earlier. The desert roads breathe with the wind. Mena had never forgotten the words. Now, while clearing dust beside the market, he found himself thinking about them again. The city truly did seem divided between water and sand. The Nile brought life. The desert tested it constantly. And between the two stood the roads, forever needing care. As sunset approached, a cooler breeze finally drifted inward from the river. The change was small at first, barely noticeable against skin still hot from the day. But gradually the air softened. People emerged from shaded homes again. Voices grew livelier. Children ran through the streets with renewed energy after resting indoors during the hottest hours. Merchants spoke with customers while lighting small oil lamps beneath hanging cloth coverings. Golden firelight flickered softly against drifting dust. The city seemed gentler now, less burdened by the heat. Mena paused beside a bakery where fresh evening bread cooled upon woven trays outside the doorway. The baker, Painasi, stood nearby brushing flour from his arms. "You worked through the wind well today," the baker said quietly. Mena shrugged slightly. "The sand was not finished with us yet." Painasi laughed softly beneath his breath. "It never is." He handed Mena a small round loaf still warm from the oven. "For your family." Mena accepted it with quiet gratitude. Such kindness mattered deeply among working people. Most families owned little beyond simple tools, clothing, and a few clay jars. Food shared after a hard day carried great meaning. As darkness slowly approached, temple bells echoed faintly across the city. Priests moved through evening rituals inside cool stone halls lit by flickering torchlight. Incense smoke drifted upward between painted columns while servants swept dust from the entrance paths one final time before night. Even sacred spaces surrendered daily to the desert. One young temple sweeper worked carefully along a carved stone stairway while watching the sunset colors fade above the rooftops. Tiny grains of sand glittered faintly across the steps beneath torchlight. He swept them away slowly. Not perfectly. Only enough. Enough for another night. Back in the market district, merchants began closing their stalls. Wooden shutters folded inward. Unsold fruit and grain disappeared into storage baskets. Donkeys carrying empty packs moved lazily through the roads toward home. The sweepers completed their final evening clearing. This work felt quieter than the labor of morning. The urgency was gone now. Instead there was calm repetition beneath the fading sky. Brush. 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 Mena swept slowly beside long shadows stretching across the road. His arms felt heavy. Each movement required effort now after the long day beneath the sun. Yet evening labor carried its own peacefulness. The city exhaled after surviving another hot day. Smoke from cooking fires rose gently into the darkening air. The smell of lentils and roasting fish drifted through the streets. Families gathered near doorways while lamps flickered softly inside mud brick homes. The roads became quieter. Softer. Dust settled slowly over the earth. At last Mena rested his broom against one shoulder and looked down the market road stretching before him into the evening shadows. Fresh footprints already crossed the newly swept ground. Thin lines of drifting sand moved gently across the surface beneath the cooling breeze. Tomorrow morning the roads would need clearing once again. But tonight they were passable. Tonight the city could rest. Mena began walking home beneath the first appearing stars. Around him, other workers disappeared gradually into narrow streets carrying worn brooms and tired bodies back toward waiting families and rooftop sleeping mats. Above the city, the sky deepened into dark blue. The Nile reflected moonlight once more. And beyond the green valley, unseen in the darkness, the desert wind continued moving patiently through endless dunes, preparing to send fresh sand toward the sleeping roads before dawn arrived again. The moon rose slowly above the Nile Valley, pale and quiet in the deepening night sky. Its light spread softly across the city roofs and dusty roads, touching the tops of temple walls and the calm surface of the river. The heat of the day still lingered inside the stone and mud brick, though the air had finally become gentle enough for tired bodies to rest. Across the city, families settled into sleep. Children curled beneath thin linen coverings on rooftops where cooler air moved more freely. Elderly workers stretched aching legs beside clay water jars still warm from the day. Somewhere nearby, a mother whispered softly to a restless child while distant dogs barked once and then fell silent again. Mena sat quietly upon his rooftop beside the small loaf of bread Panasi had given him earlier that evening. His youngest daughter slept nearby with one arm stretched across a woven mat. His wife rested beside the low wall at the roof's edge while watching the moonlight shimmer faintly across the distant Nile. For a long while no one spoke. The city itself seemed half asleep already. Only soft sounds drifted upward from the roads below. A donkey shifting beside a cart. Sand moving gently across stone. The low murmur of late travelers walking through narrow streets. Mena leaned back slowly and stared upward into the dark sky. The stars above Egypt always seemed endless. Bright. Still. Unmoving while everything below slowly changed beneath wind and time. His father had once told him that roads were like rivers made of dust. They never truly stayed the same from one day to the next. The shape remained familiar, but the surface constantly shifted beneath footsteps and wheels. As a boy, Mena had not understood the meaning completely. Now he did. Every morning the roads were different. Every morning the workers began again. The desert never stopped moving. Far below the rooftop, the roads rested beneath pale moonlight. Thin trails of sand already crossed sections swept carefully only hours earlier. Wind drifted softly through the market district, carrying fresh grains against walls and doorways with dry whispering sounds. Shhhhhhh. The city slept while the desert continued its patient work. Near the northern gate, the night road crew remained awake beneath flickering torches mounted along the stone entrance walls. Their shadows stretched long across the drifting dust while they pushed fresh sand away from the main path leading into the city. The youngest worker among them, a thin boy named Beck, struggled to keep his eyes open. This was only his second month working nights. The hours still felt strange to him. During the day he slept in short uncomfortable stretches while heat filled the house. At night he worked beneath torch smoke and blowing dust until dawn. An older sweeper noticed the boy yawning repeatedly. "You will grow used to it," the man said quietly while scraping sand away from a wheel rut. Beck rubbed his eyes. "Do you ever stop feeling tired?" The older man thought for a moment. "Sometimes during the cool season." Beck smiled faintly beneath the torchlight. Then both returned to work. Beyond the gate, darkness covered the desert completely. Only faint outlines of distant dunes remained visible beneath the moon. Wind moved freely across the open land, shaping the sand hour after hour while travelers slept beside caravans or small roadside fires far from the city. Tomorrow many of them would arrive carrying dust from places even farther south or west. And the roads would need clearing for them too. Closer to the Nile, fishermen still worked quietly upon the water despite the late hour. Small oil lamps glowed from boats drifting slowly through the darkness while nets disappeared silently beneath the black surface of the river. The air near the docks smelled cool and damp compared to the dry city roads. Mud. Fish. Wet reeds. Yet even here the sand reached everything eventually. Dock sweepers had already cleared the loading paths once after sunset, but fresh layers drifted inward constantly from nearby open ground. Fine grains settled upon stacked fishing baskets and wooden poles while workers rested nearby waiting for dawn. Nebu, the elderly dock sweeper, sat beside the riverbank massaging his swollen knees. The night breeze moved gently across the water. For a moment he closed his eyes and simply listened. The Nile had its own sounds after midnight. Water against boats. Reeds brushing softly together. Fish breaking the surface for only an instant before vanishing again into darkness. Nebu preferred these hours. The city felt quieter then. Less crowded. Less hurried. Even the sand seemed softer beneath moonlight. Eventually he stood again with slow careful movements and lifted his scraper from the ground. The road still needed watching. In another part of the city near the temple district, Hori climbed the stone steps toward a narrow storage room where temple workers kept their brooms and cleaning tools overnight. The old sweeper moved carefully now. Age had bent his shoulders and slowed his walk, but his hands still understood every movement of the labor. He placed his broom against the wall and brushed dust from his linen clothing before stepping back outside. Moonlight filled the temple courtyard. Tall columns cast long shadows across the stone floors while faint incense drifted through the cool night air from inner chambers where sacred fires still burned softly. Thin trails of sand had already gathered near the entrance again. Hori studied them quietly. Then he smiled to himself. Tomorrow morning they would begin again. The thought no longer saddened him. The roads did not need perfection. Only care. He descended the temple stairs slowly and disappeared into the sleeping streets. Hours passed quietly over the city. The moon crossed higher through the sky while rooftop sleepers shifted beneath thin blankets. Dogs wandered silently through empty roads searching for scraps near market stalls. Warm wind carried dust through every alley and courtyard. And slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the eastern horizon began turning pale. Night thinned. The stars faded one by one above the desert. Before sunrise fully arrived, the city stirred awake once more. The bakeries came first. Fires crackled softly inside clay ovens while bakers mixed grain and water by lamplight. Smoke drifted upward through roof openings and spread through nearby streets carrying the warm comforting smell of bread. Soon after came the fishermen. Then the water carriers. Then the sweepers. Mena opened his eyes before dawn while the sky still held traces of night. His body ached deeply from years of labor, especially during these first waking moments when stiffness settled heavily inside his shoulders and back. He sat upright slowly. Nearby, his family still slept peacefully beneath the fading moonlight. For a few quiet breaths Mena remained still, listening to the distant sounds of the waking city. A broom brushing stone somewhere far away. The soft call of birds near the river. A donkey braying sleepily behind nearby homes. Another day had begun. He climbed down from the rooftop and entered the dark house below where yesterday's dust still rested along the floor edges despite evening sweeping. The oil lamp beside the wall had burned out during the night. Mena drank water carefully from a clay jar and ate a small piece of stale bread before lifting his broom once more. The wood felt familiar against his palms. Outside, cool dawn air moved softly through the streets. The roads were pale beneath the first early light. Sand had drifted deeply during the night. Mena could already see fresh ridges crossing the market road ahead like tiny desert dunes stretching between the shadows. Other workers emerged quietly from nearby houses carrying their own worn tools. No one seemed surprised by the sight. The roads always returned to the desert during the night. And every morning the workers reclaimed them again. Together they walked toward the market district while dawn slowly brightened over the Nile Valley. Brushes rested upon tired shoulders. Sand shifted softly beneath their sandals. Ahead of them, the sleeping city waited patiently for its roads to awaken once more beneath the endless steady rhythm of sweeping. The eastern sky slowly filled with soft pale light as the workers entered the market district once more. Dawn in ancient Egypt never arrived suddenly. It unfolded gently across the Nile Valley, touching the river first, then the palm trees, then the temple walls rising above the sleeping city. Shadows softened. The stars disappeared quietly into the brightening sky. Cool air lingered for only a little while longer before the heat of another day would rise from the earth. Mena walked beside the other sweepers through roads still empty of crowds. This was his favorite hour. Before the shouting merchants. Before the heavy carts. Before the dust became thick with movement. Only the workers and the roads belonged to the city now. The market street looked almost peaceful beneath the fading moonlight. Fresh sand covered large sections of the ground again, smoothing away yesterday's footprints, and wheel tracks. Thin ridges drifted against the bases of walls and wooden stalls. For a few silent moments, the workers simply studied the road ahead. Then the sweeping began. Brush. 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 The sound moved softly through the dawn like breathing. Dust rose around their ankles in pale clouds while brooms pushed slow waves of sand toward the roadside. Some workers used wide wooden scrapers to loosen deeper drifts packed tightly into wheel ruts. Others carried baskets filled with sand toward empty corners beside the city walls. No one hurried. The morning always felt long enough at first. Mena swept steadily near the entrance to the grain market where drifting sand gathered heavily after windy nights. The broom handle rubbed against the old cracks in his palms while tiny grains slipped inside his sandals with every step. He barely noticed any more. After enough years, the body accepted certain discomforts as ordinary. Nearby, Casa worked more carefully now than he had weeks earlier. His movements had become slower and steadier under the guidance of older sweepers like Hori. The roads taught patience to everyone eventually. A faint smell of warm bread drifted from the bakeries already glowing with early firelight. Bakers moved inside the dim orange rooms shaping dough while smoke rose softly into the dawn air. Soon the city would follow that smell into waking. Farther away, near the river docks, fishermen carried the morning catch inland beneath baskets wrapped with damp cloth. The roads near the Nile were darker with moisture from spilled water and wet nets. Sweepers there worked quickly to spread dry sand across slippery areas before merchants arrived. The river itself moved quietly beneath the brightening sky. Calm. Dark. Steady as it had been for generations. Mena often thought the Nile and the desert were opposites that never stopped touching each other. Water and sand. Life and exhaustion. Movement and stillness. And between them stretched the roads. As dawn brightened fully, the city slowly awakened around the workers. Doors creaked open. Children stepped sleepily into narrow alleys carrying empty water jars. Women swept dust from thresholds before preparing morning meals. Donkeys shifted beneath loads of vegetables arriving from nearby farms. The roads filled gradually with ordinary life. Still the sweepers continued ahead of the growing crowds. Near the public well, an old man carrying onions in a woven basket paused beside Mena. "You are early again," he said softly. Mena smiled faintly while sweeping. The sand was early too. The old man laughed quietly before continuing down the road. Such small conversations passed through the mornings like drifting dust itself. Simple. Brief. Familiar. The sun rose higher above the eastern horizon. Golden light spread across temple walls painted in fading colors. Dust floating through the streets glowed softly in the brightness. The coolness of dawn began disappearing quickly now beneath the growing heat. Mena loosened the cloth around his shoulders and wiped sweat from his forehead. Already the day was warming. Across the market district, merchants opened wooden shutters and arranged goods upon woven mats. Dates. Lentils. Fish. Clay jars. Bundles of reeds. Copper tools. Small piles of spices carried from distant places. Each stall depended upon the roads remaining passable. Without clear paths, carts became trapped. Animals stumbled. Trade slowed. The city itself seemed to tighten like a tired muscle whenever sand gathered too deeply. And so the workers swept constantly. Some roads required attention every few hours. Near the northern gate, where wind entered directly from the open desert, drifts formed almost immediately after clearing. Younger workers often felt frustrated there at first. But older men simply swept again. And again. And again. One experienced sweeper once told Casa, "The desert is not your enemy. It is only doing what deserts do." Casa remembered those words often now. By mid-morning, sunlight reflected brightly from the pale roads and stone walls. The city shimmered beneath rising heat. Dust clung to damp skin and settled inside every fold of linen clothing. The roads had become crowded. Children ran between market stalls. Farmers guided donkeys loaded with baskets through narrow streets. Temple servants carried water jars balanced carefully upon their shoulders. A group of scribes hurried across the square holding papyrus scrolls close against the blowing dust. Mena worked carefully around them all. His broom moved in patient arcs through the sand while people flowed constantly past him like river water around stones. Sometimes he wondered how many footsteps crossed the roads each day. Thousands perhaps. Maybe more. Most of those people would never think deeply about the roads beneath them. They simply expected movement to remain possible. That was enough. The sweepers did not work for praise. They worked because the city depended upon them. Near the pottery district, strong wind suddenly swept through the streets carrying fresh dust from beyond the western walls. Cloth coverings flapped sharply above the market stalls while pale sand lifted into the air. People narrowed their eyes against the blowing grid. Some covered baskets quickly with linen. Others turned their faces away from the wind. The sweepers lowered their heads and continued working. Brush. Brush. Scrape. The sounds persisted beneath the moving dust. Mena felt sand striking lightly against his arms and neck while he pushed another line of drifted grains toward the roadside. The desert was entering the city again. Not violently. Only steadily. Like breathing. Nearby, Hori moved through the temple road with his usual calm rhythm despite the strengthening wind. Younger workers struggled harder beside him, trying to fight the drifting sand quickly before it spread farther. But Hori never rushed. He guided the broom gently. Patiently. As though speaking softly to the road itself. Casa watched him from across the street and slowed his own movements slightly. The older man noticed and nodded once without speaking. Lessons in Egypt were often quiet. By midday, the heat became heavy once more. The brightest part of the day settled over the city like a great weight pressing down upon stone, dust, and tired bodies alike. Voices softened beneath the glare. Animals searched desperately for narrow strips of shade. Even the wind seemed warmer now. Many merchants rested beside their stalls eating bread dipped in oil while waiting for afternoon customers. The sweepers paused briefly too. Mena sat beside a wall near the grain market sharing water with two younger workers. Dust coated their arms almost completely. One of the younger men stared down the road shimmering beneath the heat. "Do you think the sand remembers us?" he asked quietly. The others smiled faintly at the strange question. Mena thought for a moment before answering. "No," he said softly. "But the roads do." The younger workers looked at him curiously. Mena gestured toward the crowded street where countless feet moved slowly through the drifting dust. "These roads know every person who walks them," he said. Every merchant, every fisherman, every child carrying water. The young men listened quietly. Then after a few moments, they stood again and lifted their tools. The road still needed them. Across the city, the afternoon heat deepened while sunlight shimmered above the Nile beyond the rooftops. Dust drifted endlessly through the ancient streets. And beneath it all, steady as the river itself, the quiet endless labor of sweeping continued once more. The afternoon moved slowly through the city like warm heavy water. Heat pressed down upon the roads until the air itself seemed to tremble above the pale dust. Sunlight reflected from stone walls and packed earth so brightly that many people narrowed their eyes while walking through the streets. Even the shadows beneath market cloths felt warm now. Mena continued sweeping near the grain market with tired steady movements. His shoulders ached deeply by this hour each day. The muscles along his arms burned from lifting the broom again and again since before sunrise. Dust coated the cloth wrapped around his head, turning it nearly the same color as the roads themselves. Yet the work went on. It always did. Nearby, merchants rested beside baskets of onions and grain while flies drifted lazily through the heat. Some customers still moved through the market, but more slowly now. Voices remained quiet beneath the afternoon sun. A woman purchasing lentils paused briefly near Mena while adjusting the jar balanced against her hip. "You sweep this road every day?" she asked. Mena nodded while pushing another line of sand toward the roadside. "And tomorrow too?" The woman smiled softly. "My brother worked the roads near the river once," she said. "He always came home carrying half the desert in his sandals." Mena looked down at his own feet. Sand spilled from the edges of his worn sandals with every step. "The desert likes to travel," he replied quietly. The woman laughed gently and continued on her way. Such moments passed quickly through the day. Small human voices drifting through the endless labor. Farther south near the workshop district, the roads had become deeply uneven after hours of heavy cart traffic. Wheel ruts cut through soft sand while broken bits of pottery and straw mixed into the dust beneath passing feet. Sweepers there worked constantly to smooth the paths. A team of stone workers dragging a heavy sled had nearly become trapped earlier in the afternoon when one wheel slipped into a deep patch of drifting sand beside the road. Several sweepers rushed forward immediately with scrapers and flatboards to strengthen the ground beneath the runners. The labor took time beneath the blazing heat. Sweat poured down every face. Dust clung to damp skin. But eventually the sled moved again with a long groaning sound while the workers stepped aside quietly and returned to their sweeping. The city depended upon such ordinary moments. Most people barely noticed them. Near the temple district, Hori rested beneath the shadow of a massive stone column while watching sunlight drift slowly across the courtyard floor. Temple servants moved quietly through nearby halls carrying water jars and trays of incense while priests performed afternoon rituals inside cooler inner chambers. Even here the dust remained present. Tiny grains floated through shafts of sunlight entering between carved pillars. Thin layers of sand gathered along the edges of painted steps despite repeated cleaning throughout the day. A young temple servant approached Hori carrying a clay cup of water. "You should rest longer," the boy said softly. Hori accepted the water with grateful hands. "If I rest too long," he answered quietly, "the desert grows bold." The servant smiled. Hori drank slowly while studying the road beyond the temple gate. Fresh lines of drifting sand already crossed the path he had cleared earlier that morning. He no longer felt anger toward the work. Only familiarity. The desert and the sweepers had lived together for longer than memory. Across the city, afternoon silence deepened as more people retreated indoors to escape the worst heat. Workshop doors closed halfway. Animals stood motionless beneath strips of shade. Children slept beside cool walls while mothers prepared evening meals in dim kitchens smelling of grain and smoke. The roads grew quieter for a little while. But the sweepers remained. Mena moved slowly now through the market district while warm wind brushed dust around his ankles. Every few moments he paused to stretch his back before continuing again. Brush. 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 The sound had become part of the city itself. People noticed its absence more than its presence. A group of traveling merchants entered the market road from the western gate carrying cloth bundles and copper tools from distant settlements. Their donkeys looked exhausted from the desert crossing. Dust coated their faces and clothing so heavily that they seemed shaped from the same pale earth as the roads. One merchant stopped beside Mena while adjusting a heavy pack. "Was there a storm here yesterday?" he asked. Mena shook his head slightly. "Only wind." The merchant looked down the road where thin drifts already crossed the packed earth again. "In my village," he said quietly, "we clear sand from the doorways each morning. But this," he glanced toward the crowded city streets. "This is endless." Mena rested both hands upon the broom handle for a moment. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." The merchant studied him curiously. "Does it not tire your spirit?" Mena looked toward the western desert beyond the rooftops glowing white beneath the afternoon sun. Then he answered carefully. "The river flows every day," he said. "The wind blows every day. We sweep every day." The merchant considered this silently. Then he nodded once and continued into the market with his donkeys. The afternoon stretched onward. Slow. Heavy. Dust moved gently through beams of sunlight while tired workers continued their endless routines beneath the heat. Near the public well, Casas struggled with fatigue now more than with the road itself. His arms felt weak. The scraper handle rubbed painful blisters into his palms. Every gust of warm wind seemed to carry more sand directly back across the sections he had just cleared. Frustration rose inside him quietly. He pushed harder against the scraper. The blade caught suddenly against a buried stone and twisted sharply from his grip. Hori, passing nearby, stopped immediately. The old sweeper picked up the scraper carefully and handed it back. "You are fighting the day again," he said gently. Casa lowered his eyes. "The sand keeps returning." Hori nodded. "Yes." For a few moments both men stood silently beneath the heat while dust drifted around their feet. Then Hori placed one weathered hand upon the younger worker's shoulder. "The road is not asking you to defeat the desert," he said softly. "Only to care for the people walking through it." Casa looked down the crowded street. Women carrying water jars. Children running through the dust. Merchants guiding donkeys between market stalls. The roads truly did belong to all of them. Slowly, Casa nodded. Then he lifted the scraper once more with calmer hands. By late afternoon the sunlight finally began softening above the city. Long shadows stretched from walls and columns across the dusty streets. A faint cooler breeze drifted inward from the Nile carrying the smell of water and wet reeds. People slowly returned outdoors. Market activity grew stronger again. The city seemed to awaken from its midday exhaustion. Mena welcomed the change in temperature. Evening always felt merciful after the crushing afternoon heat. Though his body remained tired, the softer light eased something inside his mind. He worked beside the grain market entrance while children played nearby in piles of swept sand. Their laughter floated softly through the evening air. One small boy used a stick to draw winding roads through the dust. Tiny roads crossing tiny deserts. Mena watched him for a moment and smiled faintly. Perhaps one day that child would sweep real roads too. Or perhaps he would fish the Nile. Or shape clay beside the workshops. Every life here carried labor. The city itself rested upon countless tired hands. As sunset slowly approached, lamps began appearing beneath market coverings and along narrow streets. Warm firelight flickered against drifting dust while smoke from cooking fires rose gently toward the darkening sky. The sweepers prepared for the evening clearing. One final careful labor before night. One final gift to the city before darkness and wind reclaimed the roads once more. The sun lowered slowly toward the western desert, and the city began to soften beneath the evening light. The harsh brightness of afternoon faded into warm gold that rested gently upon the temple walls, the market roofs, and the drifting dust crossing the roads. Long shadows stretched through the streets while the heat finally loosened its grip upon the earth. For the sweepers, this hour carried a quiet feeling of relief. The hardest part of the day had passed. Still, there was work remaining. Mena walked beside the grain market with his broom dragging soft curved lines through the dust. Around him, merchants prepared to close their stalls while evening customers hurried through the roads hoping to finish purchases before darkness deepened. The city smelled different now. Less like heat. More like cooking fires and warm bread. Lentils simmered somewhere nearby. Fish roasted over open flames beside the river road. Smoke drifted lazily upward into the glowing sky while people moved through the market with slower, calmer steps. Even the dust seemed gentler in evening light. Children carried small oil lamps through narrow alleys while mothers called softly from doorways. Donkeys returned home with empty baskets swinging lightly at their sides. Workers from the workshops walked through the streets with tired shoulders and hands stained from clay, copper, or stone dust. All day the roads had carried these people. Now the roads themselves seemed tired too. Fresh lines of sand crossed the market path again despite hours of sweeping. Tiny dunes gathered along walls and beneath wooden stall legs where the wind had pushed dust steadily through the afternoon. Mena studied the drifting sand quietly. Then he swept once more. Brush. 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 Nearby, Painasy the baker stood outside his oven arranging fresh loaves upon woven trays for the evening crowd. Warm air smelling of grain and smoke rolled through the doorway behind him. "You still work?" the baker asked softly while watching Mena clear the road. Mena smiled faintly. "The sand still works too." Painasy laughed quietly and handed a small piece of warm bread to a passing child. "It always wins in the end." Mena shook his head gently. "No," he answered. "Not while people keep walking these roads." The baker looked down the market street for a moment. Families moved through the dust carrying food and water home for the night. Temple servants crossed the square with baskets balanced carefully against their hips. Fishermen walked inland from the docks while evening light glowed across the city around them. Perhaps Mena was right. The roads did not belong to the sand alone. Near the riverbanks, the docks remained busy beneath the fading sunlight. Boats returned slowly through darkening water while fishermen unloaded the evening catch into waiting baskets. The Nile reflected deep orange colors now beneath the western sky. Sweepers worked carefully along the dock roads where damp mud mixed with drifting sand. Nebu leaned heavily upon his scraper for a moment while watching a group of young fishermen pull nets onto the shore. His knees hurt badly this evening. The pain climbed slowly upward through his legs each year now. Still he continued smoothing the roads beside the river. A fisherman carrying a basket of silver fish paused nearby. "You should rest more," the man said kindly. Nebu smiled without bitterness. "When the river rests, I will rest." The fisherman chuckled softly and continued inland toward the market. Nebu watched him disappear through the dusty road. The city never truly stopped moving. Even at night, labor waited somewhere. As twilight deepened, temple bells echoed faintly across the Nile Valley. Priests lit evening fires inside cool stone halls while incense smoke drifted upward between carved columns. The temple roads glowed softly beneath torchlight where Hori and the younger workers completed their final sweeping before night. Casa worked beside the old man in silence for a while. The road before the temple entrance looked nearly clean now. Only thin trails of dust crossed the packed earth beneath the fading light. After some time Casa spoke quietly. "Did you always know how to do this work calmly?" Hori smiled faintly while guiding his broom through another line of sand. No, Casa looked surprised. "You seem calm all the time." The old sweeper paused for a moment. "When I was young," he said softly, "I hated the wind. I hated watching the sand return after hours of work." He brushed another slow line across the road. "But the desert was older than my anger." Casa listened carefully. "So what changed?" Hori lifted his eyes toward the darkening horizon beyond the temple walls. "I understood that the roads are not meant to stay perfect," he answered. "Only cared for." The younger worker lowered his gaze thoughtfully. Around him, evening settled deeper over the city. Torches flickered beside the temple gate while warm wind carried dust gently through the streets. The roads would never remain clean for long. But perhaps that was not failure. Perhaps the labor itself mattered more than the result. Farther away near the market district, the final evening crowd slowly faded. Merchants folded cloth coverings over baskets of grain and dates. Pottery stalls disappeared behind wooden shutters. Children carrying sleepy younger brothers or sisters followed parents through roads glowing faintly beneath oil lamps. Mena completed another slow pass along the central market road. His arms felt heavy now. Each sweep of the broom pulled against aching muscles deep inside his shoulders and back. Sand rubbed painfully against the cracks in his hands. Yet evening work carried a peacefulness that morning labor did not. The city exhaled after surviving another day beneath the sun. People moved gently now. Voices remained soft. The roads belonged less to business and more to returning home. A little girl walking beside her mother stopped near Mena and watched him sweeping. "Why do you clean the road every day?" she asked innocently. Her mother looked embarrassed and tried to guide her onward, but Mena only smiled. "So your feet can walk safely home," he answered. The girl looked down at the smooth path before her. Then she nodded seriously and continued walking. Mena watched her disappear into the evening crowd. Perhaps no one truly noticed the sweepers most of the time. But the roads remembered. The roads carried everyone. As darkness spread fully across the city, the final sweeping slowly ended. Workers stacked baskets beside walls. Scrapers leaned against storage rooms near the market. Brooms rested upon tired shoulders as men and women began walking home beneath the first stars of night. Dust still drifted softly across the roads behind them. Already the desert was returning. Mena walked through narrow streets glowing with warm lamplight from inside mud brick homes. Families gathered around evening meals while smoke drifted upward through rooftop openings. Somewhere nearby, someone played a quiet tune upon a reed flute. The city sounded sleepy now. Peaceful. The Nile beyond the houses reflected silver moonlight beneath the dark sky. Palm trees swayed gently beside the river while insects hummed softly among the reeds. Mena reached his home and paused before entering. He looked back once toward the road stretching through the dim evening shadows. Fresh sand already crossed sections he had swept only moments earlier. He smiled faintly to himself. Tomorrow morning the roads would need him again. And before dawn, while the city still slept beneath the stars, the first quiet sound of sweeping would return once more to the ancient dusty streets beside the Nile. Night settled deeply over the city, calm and warm beneath the wide Egyptian sky. The roads grew quiet one by one as families disappeared indoors or climbed carefully onto flat rooftops to sleep beneath the cooler air. Oil lamps flickered softly behind woven reed curtains. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward in thin fading lines before disappearing into the darkness. The heat of the day still rested inside the stone walls and packed earth roads, though the evening breeze from the Nile had softened it enough for tired bodies to breathe more easily. Menas sat again upon the roof of his home with his family nearby. His wife repaired a torn linen cloth beside the weak glow of a small lamp while his children slowly drifted toward sleep upon woven mats. Somewhere beyond the neighboring houses, a dog barked briefly before silence returned. The city always felt different at night. Smaller somehow. Gentler. Without the noise of carts and merchants, the roads seemed almost forgotten beneath the moonlight. Yet even now, sand continued moving quietly through them. Mena could hear it sometimes when the wind strengthened. Soft grains brushing across stone. Tiny dry whispers along the walls. Shhhhhhhh. The desert never truly rested. His youngest daughter stirred sleepily beside him. "Will you sweep again tomorrow?" she murmured. Mena smiled softly in the darkness. "Yes." "Will there still be sand?" "Yes." The child seemed satisfied with this answer. Within moments she drifted back into sleep while warm night air moved gently across the rooftop. For a long time Mena simply watched the moonlight resting upon the distant Nile. The river appeared silver and calm beneath the stars. Boats tied along the docks rocked slowly against wooden posts while fishermen prepared quietly for another night upon the water. Somewhere out there, beyond the green riverbanks and sleeping city, stretched the endless desert. Dark dunes. Dry wind. Ancient silence. And always more sand waiting to travel toward the roads by morning. Near the northern gate, the night sweepers continued working beneath torchlight. Beck, the youngest among them, struggled to stay awake again as he pushed a broom through fresh drifts gathered near the entrance road. His arms felt weak tonight. Every muscle along his back ached from days of labor and poor sleep. The older workers noticed but said little. Exhaustion was part of learning this work. One man scraped packed sand away from a wheel rut while another carried baskets toward the outer wall where the wind could scatter the dust again into the darkness. Above them, torch flames flickered in the warm breeze. Beyond the gates, a caravan approached slowly from the desert road. The travelers moved carefully beneath moonlight, guiding tired donkeys loaded with sacks of grain and bundles of woven cloth. Their footsteps sounded soft against the sand-covered path. When they reached the city entrance, the lead traveler paused beside Beck. "You clear this road every night?" he asked quietly. Beck nodded. The traveler studied the drifting sand around them. "In the desert," he said softly, "we follow old paths by memory because the wind hides them each morning." Beck looked down at the road beneath his broom. "The city roads disappear too," he answered. The traveler smiled faintly. "Then you are like guides." For a moment Beck stood silently beneath the torchlight. No one had ever described the work that way before. The caravan moved onward into the sleeping city while the young sweeper returned to his labor with slower, thoughtful movements. Perhaps the roads were a kind of guidance after all. Farther south near the river docks, Nebu rested beside stacked fishing baskets while watching moonlight shimmer across the water. The night air smelled cool and damp here compared to the dry market roads. Fishermen worked quietly nearby. Nets slipped through dark water. Oars moved gently. Soft voices drifted across the Nile and faded again into the night. Nebu preferred these hours more with each passing year. The city felt honest at night. Without crowds and noise, small sounds became important again. Water against wood. Sand against stone. Breathing. Footsteps. He closed his eyes briefly and listened. Even from here he could hear faint sweeping somewhere deeper inside the city. The sound comforted him. As long as brooms still moved across the roads, life in the city continued as it always had. Near the temple district, Hori walked slowly through moonlit streets toward his small home beside an old courtyard wall. His broom rested across one shoulder while his sandals brushed softly through drifting dust. The temple roads behind him were already gathering new sand. Tomorrow morning he would clear them again before sunrise. The thought no longer felt heavy. Only familiar. As he passed through a narrow alley, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to sweep sand away from her doorway with a small reed brush. Tia. The widow who lived alone near the well. Without speaking, Hori stepped beside her and lowered his own broom to the ground. Together they swept the small doorway path beneath the moonlight. Brush. 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 The woman smiled gently after a while. You have already worked all day. Hori shrugged softly. The sand worked all day too. Tia laughed quietly. The sound echoed warmly through the empty alley. When the doorway finally looked clear enough for morning, both old workers leaned upon their brooms for a moment while cool wind drifted through the street. We are all becoming slow, Tia murmured. Hori looked upward toward the stars. Yes, he said softly. But the roads are patient with old feet. They stood together a little longer before parting quietly into the night. Hours passed. The moon crossed slowly through the sky above the Nile Valley while the city slept beneath layers of warm darkness and drifting dust. Sand gathered once more along market roads. Wheel tracks softened. Footprints disappeared. The desert reclaimed the streets patiently grain by grain. Then at last, far away beyond the eastern horizon, the first faint gray light of dawn began appearing again. The cycle returned. Bakers woke before sunrise and lit their ovens. Fishermen folded sleeping mats beside the river. Water carriers stretched sore shoulders before lifting empty jars. And the sweepers rose once more from rooftops and darkened rooms. Mena awoke while the stars still lingered overhead. For a few moments he remained still beside his sleeping family, listening to the quiet breathing around him. Then slowly he sat upright. His back hurt badly this morning. A deep ache settled through his shoulders and knees from years of labor upon the roads. He rubbed tired hands across his face while cool dawn air drifted gently across the rooftop. Below, the city remained mostly silent. But not completely. Already he could hear distant sweeping somewhere in the darkness. Someone had started early. Mena smiled faintly. He climbed down into the house and drank from the clay water jar near the doorway. The water tasted slightly warm after the night heat, but it eased the dryness in his throat. Outside, the roads waited once more beneath pale moonlight. Fresh sand covered them. Thin drifting ridges crossed the market path like waves upon quiet water. Other workers emerged from nearby homes carrying brooms, scrapers, and woven baskets. No one spoke much at this hour. Words felt unnecessary before sunrise. Together they stepped into the sleeping streets. The first soft sounds of sweeping rose once more into the cool ancient dawn beside the Nile while the city slowly prepared itself for another day of dust, labor, footsteps, heat, and patient endless roads. Now the night has grown very still beside the Nile. The roads lie quiet beneath pale moonlight, their drifting sand glowing softly in the darkness. The markets have emptied. The workshops have fallen silent. Even the donkeys and dogs sleep beneath the warm Egyptian sky. Far away, the desert wind continues its slow journey across endless dunes. Grain by grain, the sand moves patiently through the ancient world. And somewhere in the sleeping city, a broom still rests beside a doorway, waiting for morning. Mena sleeps now upon the rooftop beside his family. The long labor of the day has finally left his tired shoulders. Nearby, oil lamps fade into darkness one by one while cool air drifts inward from the river. The Nile moves quietly through the night. Steady. Ancient. Calm beneath the stars. Tomorrow, before sunrise, the workers will rise again. The bakers will light their ovens. The fishermen will untie their boats. The merchants will return to the roads. And the sweepers will walk once more through the silent streets carrying worn brooms across tired shoulders. Not because the sand can ever truly be defeated, but because people still need paths to follow through the dust. And so the roads will be cared for gently, patiently, one soft sweep at a time. Now the city grows quieter still. The temple fires burn low. The market stalls rest beneath drifting sand. Palm trees sway softly beside the dark water of the Nile. And above it all, the ancient stars shine silently over Egypt, just as they always have. So let the warm desert wind grow distant now. Let the footsteps fade. Let the soft brushing of brooms disappear slowly into the night. And rest there beside the quiet river, where the ancient world sleeps peacefully beneath the endless sky.